This is Sheila Pearl. Let's talk about making love better. This is a podcast in its early stages, and I have invited a very good friend of mine, Brian Baird, to offer us episode number 2 of this new podcast that we have launched as of what I call Love Day, February 14th. And we're continuing this conversation because making love better is about every relationship you have, whether it's with your sweetheart, whether it's with your children, your friends, your siblings, your parents, the people that are precious to you, and you want to make that relationship more precious. So this is about making love better in every way. So the first episode that I talked about with Brian talked about kind of the basic elements of loving, and we just got the conversation going. And towards the end of the conversation, we made kind of a left turn into an aspect of love that, to me, as both a relationship coach and a bereavement counselor for the past 40 years, I've learned that grief is a sweet companion and sometimes a painful reality about love. And so I have a little quote that I want to begin with just to set the stage for this conversation with Brian. And then I'm going to introduce Brian, who will introduce himself as well. So grief never ends, but it changes. It is a passage, not a place to stay. Grief is not a sign of weakness, nor a lack of faith. It is the price of love.
Okay. Hi, everybody. I'm Brian Baird. Hey, I love that entire quote that you have. Who is that your work, or is that the?
No, it's anonymous. I have no idea. I found it on Facebook, and I have no idea.
Okay. So I'd like to take that last statement where grief is the price of love and temporarily pause. I do have a comment, and I do have a comment about that that I'd like to make a little later on. So inside of this entire discussion, which we talked about last time, is how grief was another way to advance our awareness of authentic love, deep love, not conditional love. And then you had said something about the fact that we should maybe make that part 2 of your inaugural podcast energy. And I'm happy to come back and do this with you. So thank you for having me.
I'm grateful. As those of you who joined us for the first episode know, Brian has been a friend of mine and a colleague of mine for the past 15 years. And we are in aligned fields, but do things that are very different as well. So if you had listened to episode 1, you know that we get very deep into the nooks and crannies of the conversation. And Brian is a person that I value deeply for his life experience and his expertise professionally as well. So what I've invited him to do is to engage in this conversation about grief, because he has become well acquainted with grief as I have. And I wanted him to tell you his story about how it's changed him. So go for it.
Oh, so I just should start yapping away, right?
Just start yapping away.
Well, what came up last time was a little cliffhanger, right? The idea is that you were asking, what was it that was in my journey that made me more adequately, or maybe I would say for me, it enhanced my connection to love. And, you know, from my journey and my experience, I would say that my early stages of grief, they all tied, going back to the fact that I had a father who was prone to unexpected, well, I guess at some level you could expect it, but at random triggers. There would be no understanding what the trigger was. It was just a trigger of some kind. And then profound rage. And as a young boy, I was a target. I was convenient. It was the older boy of the 2 boys in the family. And whether we were both there or not, if I was in the room, I was um, prone to taking on his energy, and it often it was ended up with welts on my rear end and my legs from a belt. He loved the belt. I don't know if he learned that from his father or not, but he was really handy with that belt, and created dread and all kinds of things. So it's like you look at my personal development at the time, and all I can say is that it was a wonky, wobbly experience. And inside of this thing was both my parents were I don't want to sound judgmental, but both my parents had their own developmental issues, so they were in many ways still children.
Well, let me just jump in.
Mm-hmm.
I would say that would apply to probably most of our parents who have some form of dysfunction that creates our dysfunction.
Right. So the challenge being is for me as a parent was not introducing. I'm just going to sidestep this or sidebar this for a little bit. I didn't want to be a parent because I very much saw or at least I believed from some of my own personal patterns and observations, is that whatever parenting style was done to you, you did to your kids. And there is a degree of truth to that. I mean, how many people do we hear is like, I said I would never be like my mother, and oh my gosh, her words came right out of my mouth, and they have regret and pain to even having said those words, because they know what those words felt like when they were kids, and they just did it to theirs. And I just decided I didn't want to be a parent, and in my first pass discussing it. So go ahead.
So, before I forget, I want to jump in and add the caveat that, yes, in fact, a famous book was written, My Mother, Myself, which was really about that whole idea. This woman decided she didn't want to be like her mother. I'm not going to be like my mother. And of course, she turned out to be just like her mother. So part of the distinction that she discovered after all of her interviews with other daughters who had vowed they'd never be like their mother, was that if the daughter focused only on not wanting to be like the mother, they would most likely become like the mother, because the universe doesn't know the difference between I will or won't be like such and such. All the universe knows is you're focusing on that. So the magic formula is to be aware of what you don't want to be, and then choose to be specifically what you want to be. So don't focus on what you don't want, focus on what you do want.
Right. And I'm a firm believer in that, especially since I also believe that it's not just the universe. From all of my work and the different therapies and modalities that I work with, is that the unconscious mind cannot hear the no part. It only hears the words. And so it will, if no anger versus anger, no love versus love. All it knows is that the word no doesn't belong, and it just evicts it from the conversation. So I didn't want to be a parent, though. I did have, like, it wasn't like if I had become a parent and said I didn't want to be like my dad, you're right, I could have very much been like my dad. And in fact, in my early 20s, even without being a parent, I was prone to high, I won't say as deep a sense of a sense of rage, or at least in my own personal observation of who I was, but I was easy to ire. I was a hothead and triggerable in that regard. So I would say it was probably good that I didn't become a parent, at least in my first pass at looking at this. I am a parent today, though. And when I met, and I guess we're going to have a little sidebar from the whole discussion about grief, but it will lace back in. We'll get this all put back into the picture. So I met a woman who wanted kids, and I was at least, I'll say, smart enough to know that to marry somebody who wants kids, and if you're not going to have kids, that's a recipe for a kind of disaster. So I did some soul searching, and I realized, okay, I will, I'll be a parent. I just won't be a parent who gets involved with the kids. I'll just make the money or whatever it was going to do and let her be the parent. So you laugh, but that was the logic. The,
Yeah, well, it's funny now. It's not, I'm sure it wasn't very funny then, but looking back, we can see how avoiding the very thing that you want to avoid doesn't work, does it?
right. I was very concerned that I would inflict harm in the same way it was done to me. So so I had these coping mechanisms that were like, first not to be a parent at all, and then to be like this kind of remote parent or distant parent. But I also thought someplace underneath the hood, I must have known that that wasn't completely rational. So what I did do is I put off parenthood for a while. All kinds of tricks I had placed in the marriage. Not that we didn't have our physical moments, but I figured out ways to make sure there was no baby from those physical moments. So, and then I studied parenthood. I literally, every time I saw a parent-child thing, what was going on, whether it was at the mall, the beach, a party, or we were invited to dinner at somebody else's house who had kids, I watched all the dynamics and I could see this I like, that I don't. And I was doing analysis as to why these things were happening, what was going on. Like when, I saw kids were having temper tantrums, after a lot of studying, I began to realize the kids are having temper tantrums because the parents create the temper tantrums. So I learned a lot in those 8 years. We did not have a child in the first 8 years of our marriage. We created its own contention in the marriage, and that'll get back to another avenue of what we're discussing here, which has to do with grief. But I will say that by the time I became a parent, one, I was no longer fit to ire. It didn't happen. It took it to this day, and from that day on, it takes a lot for me to get angry about something. Not because I suppress it, but because I learned to bring out a different kind of energy. I'm not sure how I did it. At the moment, it's not clear to me. I just know that I changed that angry side of me. I didn't erase it per se. I just no longer needed it, if that makes any sense. I released and revealed a different version of me.
Well, they say everything begins with intention. And I'm hearing that you had decided long ago your intention was to not be like your father. So, your awareness wasn't what you didn't want to be.
Mm-hmm.
And so then your awareness took you to the next step, and that was your intention was to discover how you wanted to be. In other words, you knew what you didn't want to be, but you wanted to watch examples of what you wanted to be because you didn't grow up with those. So
Right.
you needed role models, you needed examples, whether it's real people or movies or books or whatever, because it was your intention to be different, to somehow manage and to channel that anger, to perhaps manage it better.
Yeah. So I think channeling maybe what was really maybe it's not that I never got angry again. I mean, it certainly was when the marriage had its challenges, and if there was anybody who um I'll use the phrase push my buttons, my bride
Of
was able to do
course,
that.
of course. That's why
And but it was never as volatile. It was never like that out of control. Although I was loud, it was never like it was like when I was in my 20s, and it was never like it was when I was experiencing this at the hand of my father. So, but what happened though is when I was a child, I learned that in order to find a way to avoid those whippings and beatings, I started to create this public persona. And inside of that persona, by the way, was to show no pain, to show no
no emotion or just no
well, almost no emotion, but mostly to show that I can't be hurt by this hand. And when I started taking on that energy, it changed something between my father and me. It's not that he was any better a man. It's just that I think he realized that he wasn't getting from me what he used to get, which was whatever, terror, fear, anger, screaming. I think he needed that, and I was no longer giving him that. So I began to take all of this stuff that he had done to me as a child, I look back on it now and say he did it for me because it's formed very much my journey of who I am today. But back in those days, it was, you certainly weren't thinking, oh, this is a learning lesson. You don't have those things coming along. You just kind of go, I got to somehow or other stop this and manage this. And he was still prone to rage, and he still sometimes was prone to the being heavy with the hand. It was more immediate and reactive, and it wasn't continuous like it was when I was a kid. I learned also, though, is these things were actually grief points in my life. And because I had learned to put this mask on, I also had learned to pick up the carpet and sweep this grief under the carpet, which I'd continue to do for a lifetime.
So could you explain what you mean by those grief points? That's really important.
Well, yeah, I'll give you an idea. Is when you're a young child, you're 5 years old, 6 years old, and a parent attacks you. There's all kinds of stuff that goes on there. Betrayal, because betrayal of trust, betrayal of love, betrayal of a host of other things. Because as a 5 or 6 year old, we're born to be loved. We're born to feel love. We're born to give love. We're all these kinds of things. And now we start to look at, I'm now 7 years old. I'm starting to look at it and goes, okay, that's done. This guy, I can't count on this guy for that stuff. It's painful. It's whatever. But I never was given, first of all, the equipment to process grief.
Of course.
Because my parents were both in this childlike state. My mother, who I've recently had conversations with about this, she has no memory of these moments. She's pretty much was fending for herself to such a degree. She's blocked out any memory of these assaults that took place.
Okay, but before you go on, I want to clarify what that grief point was about for you as a child, because you weren't processing it directly, but the mechanism, the internal defense mechanism, was the push.
Grief is loss, right?
Grief is loss.
Right.
And
so I had loss of innocence.
Yeah, and oh, yes, okay. So that, yes. So
loss of support, loss of what I would say is a rational vector of love, true love. Loss of stability, all kinds of things that I had losses of, and each one of these
loss of trust,
right?
of comfort, loss of faith, loss of being able to,
and I'll even say loss of truth.
Right. And I want to underscore the first thing you said. This is the loss of innocence. And that was one of the first themes that we decided last time to jump into, because grief is and has been for you and is for most of us a loss of innocence. And we don't see it that way, right?
When you're a child, you have nothing to process it with. You just know it's boom.
Well, frankly, even as an adult, we don't look back and see that as an element of grief. We don't really think about the distinction of that being a loss of innocence either, until we become more thoughtful, perhaps more philosophical. So talk more about that.
So over my childhood, and my parents got divorced, which is another loss. Even though my father was created a wobbly, wonky childhood experience.
Yeah.
You think of your parents as, although he was on a little bit of a Sir Galahad, around the country, come home when he feels like it type person. I still thought of this as the family unit. So when my parents got divorced, which was inevitable from the, as an adult looking back on those years, but even as a child, I don't care when parents divorce and the kids are still young. I don't care how carefully you talk to them. They're still going to think they had a role in it.
Absolutely. And until we started to talk about this, I hadn't remembered and really connected the dots for myself about the role that my parents' divorce played in my sadness and depression, which was a form of grief for a child.
Mm-hmm. So, and perhaps because of the way society worked at the time, we were very focused on these male influences. And I'm not suggesting we shouldn't have male influences today. I'm just saying that there are mechanisms we can use to provide male influences, healthy male influences in a child's life that don't have to be a biological parent. So, but I didn't have any, there was no replacement for what I already didn't have. There was nothing coming in and putting in this healthy guidance in
Right.
terms of how to be a human being, how to be a person, eventually how to be a man, um, how to adult, as I was getting into those, those things.
Mhm.
And so, and then I think learning to process grief to whatever degree you can as a child is still a pathway towards adulting, to make up a phrase that we have all been using. It probably is in the dictionary already anyway. So adulting, let's just call it the path to adulthood is adulting, right?
It
So,
is. Yes.
so there were all of these sort of wobbly, wonky experiences. And every time I had a form of a loss, whether it was the divorce, the issues that started with my father, love interests along the way, and by the time I arrived in my 20s, I was pretty good at just taking grief and shelving it or sweeping it under the carpet.
Mm.
Now, I think, without going into all the details, you and I had an off the show conversation about a stage where I was in very serious state of depression in college.
Yes.
And I had made a decision to never go that low again. A very, very striking, conscientious, not decision followed by action, because decisions don't mean much by themselves. But I had made this decision and then followed through with determined action that I would never feel that low again. And I would say that and it probably was a lifesaver for a variety of reasons. I never got that low again. Here's the challenge. So I've since looked back on my life and looked at other people who've done similar things. When you mute the lows, you mute the highs.
Yes,
So you
indeed.
end up living in a very narrow band of emotion, which after time will actually be profoundly of disservice to your development, your health, a whole host of other things.
Yes. So I had told you in that sidebar conversation last time that I learned from singing the truth of that. And I was in the midst of developing my voice. I was a professional singer for about 40 years. And in the early stages of developing my voice, I went to a voice builder who helped me develop the lower voice so that I can sing higher. And he said, if you don't develop your lower voice, you won't be able to hit the high notes with great strength. And it's really to the point in life that if we're not willing to go to the depths of our emotions, we're not able, literally, we're not able to feel the heights. So we steal our own capacity to feel great joy when we think that we're saving ourselves from pain and suffering by not allowing ourselves to feel great pain.
I think your physical lifetime analogy for this is a perfect description of what happens in the psyche of people who do like I did, which is where they have some or other managed a process. It doesn't mean that depression isn't there. It just means that the way that it's managed is to kind of almost like the depression is underneath the operating bands of your emotions. So you've found a way to suppress the depression and the grief that goes with it. And it carries along almost the phrase I would use is perturbating or maybe getting ready to boil type of thing underneath.
Oh, you mean
And
percolating?
percolating is another word, perturbating, percolating.
Oh,
So you
that's
have
interesting. Okay,
so
yes.
you have like this place where eventually though the boil is going to happen. There's nothing that you can really do about that. It's just that because of my determination, it was actually decades I operated in this on this parameter, and I was able to replace a lot of my emotional construct with what I would call intellectual construct. Very, very interested and well voiced and versed in science and engineering, and even part of my college degree had an electrical engineering minor, which was once you study engineering, you kind of look at everything as a system too. So you're just evaluating life, and whether you wanted to talk to me about particle physics or cosmology, or you wanted to talk to me about medicine or something, I felt I probably had something to say about just about everything, because I managed my life around data and facts.
So another way of framing that is that you learn to stay in your head, to be rational, and not go to your heart.
And I bet any one of us, anybody listening, or you and I, could probably relate to knowing somebody who was such a raving intellectual that they were completely, almost like devoid of emotion, and maybe for the very same reasons that I did.
Yes, absolutely.
So I've met a few people that were so snobby and unrelatable because of their intellectualism, and they would hold on to their intellectualism with great pride. In the meantime, I now look at my life as it's been revealed to me today, and I'm going, thank heavens there's room for change. Because and I'll talk a bit more about my journey on how the vectors of grief and all these things came to play. As you said before, is grief as a lesson, or it is your lessons, or as we've experienced loss along the way, where we need to we're doing some regrouping, typically, if we're not sweeping it under the carpet, and learning how to turn these challenges with grief and possibly sadness and avoid depression by not permanently sustaining grief. And then it becomes almost like rocket fuel for the kinds of development and stretching that leads to profound joy. And I would say profound joy was not in my vocabulary, at least not emotionally in my vocabulary. It was intellectually perhaps, and not emotionally, because I was in that narrow band of emotional operation. So I met and married a wonderful woman. We're now divorced, but she's still a wonderful woman. We love each other. We just it was clear from the very get-go in many ways we should not have been living together. We made it 24 years. We adopted a beautiful little girl from China who's now 19 years old, and
she's beautiful.
She's in every way, intellectually, it's just like just brilliant kid. The thing that was interesting is that when the first 4 years of our marriage, it was kind of a honeymoon. The last 20 years of the marriage, it was a divorce in the making. And so one of the things that I had alluded to in the last show is the idea is that I processed my grief in the marriage. So when the marriage was over, it was almost a relief.
So let's not step over that. That's a really important distinction. And by the way, I'm sure there are a lot of people listening to our conversation, Brian, who have experienced the same phenomenon, that they somehow knew that what they had once had that may have been magical for a brief period of time was no longer. And then they spent the remainder of that relationship that they stayed in grieving. So that, as you say, by the time you did decide to divorce, you'd almost, completed much of the grieving process, because as we know, grieving goes through stages. And the final stage is acceptance and making your peace with it. It sounds like that's kind of what you did.
To a degree, though, I want to be very clear, as I was still operating in this narrow emotional band.
You mean you had not yet found the
and this is a fairly recent years. Years, like you've known me a long time. So remember the Brian that was always button heads with you intellectually.
Yes.
And then remember the Brian who's like almost like pain-free experience for you today. A lot of this changes only in the last few years, so
exactly.
And so
so remind us what the cliffhanger was, so we know where we're going. The cliffhanger.
Well, there's another, the vectors of grief in my life having been fairly recently finally processed. And I've only been telling one aspect of it so far. I mean, we could say one aspect was how it built up, starting with my father. That was
Right.
something I didn't even allude to last time. What I really did say in last time is that one of my vector resolution patterns was began, but was certainly by no means matured or fully revealed or realized during the marriage. But it was very clear I was already grieving during the marriage because and to the processing grief and experiencing grief aren't always the same thing. And that's, I want to make that very clear from my perspective, is that I was feeling grief doesn't mean I was doing anything valuable with it. So I was still picking up the carpet, sweeping grief under it, throwing the carpet back down and bucking up and moving on because of that narrow operating band. So, and I would say this, that the narrow emotional operating band was a contributor. It's not the only thing. We both went into this marriage very shields up.
Sure. But
And so there's not a lot of intimacy and trust in that kind of thing. And frankly, if you want my opinion, without intimacy and trust, you ain't got a long-term relationship.
and that's part of the major message in this conversation. Without intimacy, which means without being willing to be vulnerable, which
Mm-hmm.
means without being willing to feel deeply so that you can feel the depths and the highs of all your relationships,
Mm-hmm.
uh, you have no life. You don't have the full experience of being alive. If you don't allow yourself to feel low, you can't feel the high. So again, just remind us where we're going, because what was that cliffhanger, that mystery? There was a
Well, the other one was where I finally had a cataclysmic point where I really had made the opposite, the reverse decision that I had made in my early 20s. I want to say early 20s, so it's probably 20, actually. I think about it. So when I was 20, I decided never to get that low again. And when I was in my late 50s, I'm saying I must absolutely go that low. And so the marriage was had been deteriorating for a long time, and it, in many ways, it probably was never a marriage in the successful sense. It was, we managed to figure out a way to make it work for 24 years. Maybe both of us were just not interested in the failure as part of the discussion, and that may be, and that's another story, another time, another whole
well.
conversation.
So Brian, as they say, people come into our lives for a season, a
Mm-hmm.
reason, or a lifetime.
Right.
And your ex-wife, still your friend,
Mm-hmm. That's right.
you love each other.
Mm-hmm.
I would say she's come into your life for a lifetime, but not necessarily to be your life partner.
And that seems very clear. And I should say she was definitely instrumentally part of some of my life lessons.
And
That
I think that's one of the major messages I want to bring home in every single conversation that I have on this new podcast. And that is, every relationship in our lives brings us a gift.
couldn't have said it better. And the gift can be lessons and co-journeying through lessons. Sometimes the lessons are what separate us, and sometimes lessons bring us tighter together. And I very, very quickly after the marriage was over, and I was one of those people that was very cognizant, because of my work and everything, was very cognizant. You don't just rush around and get another relationship because you need to have some time to be yourself and all those other things. But I very arrogantly just said, oh, well, because I grieved. The marriage was over years ago. It's just a matter where the ink was signed. I've already processed all that. So I thought. And the reason why I say so I thought is because I'm still, even at the termination of the judge signing the paperwork, at the end of the contract, at the end of the marriage, I'm still operating this narrow band of emotion. And it may have widened a little bit over the years, but because of my daughter and some of these feelings of love and other parameters, but for the most part, I was still operating in that squashed zone of emotions in order to never feel that low again.
So I'm sorry to interrupt you, but I realized I had not fully edified you to the extent of sharing with our listeners the number of things that you do. It's a long list. So, but in view of this conversation, it's fascinating to me that among the modalities that you have become expert in is neuro linguistic programming
Right.
and hypnotherapy, which has everything to do with how our subconscious mind drives the engine.
It's kind of interesting to me. I don't think I could have the intimate knowledge with those two modalities that I do without having the journey that I had. I've been playing around with NLP for a couple of decades, or maybe close to 3 decades, because it was a tool to support the sales process.
Right.
It was a very circumstantial, and I'd even say somewhat circumspect way to harness that modality, because it was more like maybe questioning even on the ethics side of things. If I look at it from my own current view of the practice, is that I was using it to enhance sales results. So I knew what NLP was from a different perspective. What I could not fully appreciate NLP and hypnosis in terms of what they could bring to the table was the concentrated power of our unconscious, and the processing of emotions in the filters between the conscious and the unconscious mind, largely because I didn't have a real intimate relationship with my own emotions until recently,
Yes.
until recent years. So
tell us, Brian, please, what happened? What was the magic, the super sauce? What do we call it? The magic sauce, the super sauce, the.
Well, I'd say, in many ways, when the ink was dried on the divorce decree, and by that point, I had gotten involved with another woman who is in her own right brilliant, and it wasn't clear to me, by the way, just a real quick thing is this: the universe has a thing about patterns.
Yes, indeed.
And I have to say, in some ways, I've always known this at an unconscious level. But here was now an opportunity for me to have this sort of conscious thing, and it's like looking at my relationship with my ex-wife, certain kinds of sensitivities that she had that were just completely incongruous with who I was. I'm loud and brash and maybe I won't say energetically vulgar is probably the best way to put it, not necessarily language vulgar. and bull in a china shop type of energy, because I was hyper unaware. In many ways, I just wasn't aware of that how reactive and animalistic and how
Raw. How about
and but also strictly an external version of this. Like there wasn't much internal core to work with. Never got trained in this, never had any mentorship. In fact, it even gets uglier when you look at a lifetime, because when people are stepping in and say, oh, I'd be happy to give you some guidance, and I'm going, I'll figure it out on my own. Like not a lot of trust in me. So I wasn't going to let anybody come in and start telling me how things work, because I'm smart enough to do it on my own. That's the energy, I should say. I'm smart enough.
And notice where that came from. I mean, the story of your childhood is essential, because the story you tell is the grieving of your loss of innocence, in that you lost trust. And that loss of trust has followed you. That's the pattern I see.
Right. So keep that word trust in mind, because it's gonna play a very interesting.
It's gonna come in again, of course.
It's gonna come in again. So and ladies and gentlemen who are listening here, there is rarely a single emotion at play. So we're complex beings.
Exactly.
And if we find layers, this is going on, if you dig a little deeper, you'll find 5 more. So trust has been a key word in my entire life. Trust, and I would say love is a key word in my entire life. And the kind of power of vulnerability would be a key word in my entire life, not the kind of power of force. I was always a power of force. As a narcissist, which is how I spent most of my years.
Right, but you
It's a
spent
power
most of
force.
your life avoiding feeling vulnerable.
Right. And then also forging relationships to fill holes that not having those things, as you
Mm.
described, trust, power and love and all this. So you start curating experiences to fill those holes, is what I call medicating. But you find these relationships, you are often your relationships are shallow and superficial, but they are based on your appearance anyway. So by definition, shallow and superficial. So the marriage is over by legal decree now, and and I've stepped into another relationship. But I mean, by this point, I'm thinking, done that, cleared that, I'm past that. It's like, because I have not, still operating in the narrow emotional band, right?
Right,
So I'm not recognizing all the red flags that hadn't been processed yet.
right.
I'm not seeing them. In the meantime, I'm very capable, without patting myself on the back, but I'm just very capable of seeing other people's forests and trees, even though I can't see the forest from the trees in my own life. It's kind of a cool thing to note that, ask me a question, I'll get some answers for you, advice or whatever you want to call it. If I ask me a question, whew, this is a whole different story. So,
Well, the irony here is you've known me all these years and you know what I do. Did
right.
you ever come to me? Absolutely not.
Remember the trust thing, though.
I know, I know.
And it's not that you're not trustworthy. I just wasn't
No,
trusting.
exactly.
So, and I find it funny because funny in an odd way, as fun as funny, haha, that grief became probably one of the biggest elements of my life. And this is one of your deepest specialties, is bereavement counseling. And here I'm telling you the story, and you're going, I could have saved you a lot of time, Brian, but I was not in a position to reach out to you and ask for your advice.
And you needed to go through that journey in some way because what occurred for you from what you're telling me was some form of precious gift.
Yes. So let's go ahead to, I won't call it the final chapter, the latest chapter.
Yes, there's no
I got
final
I got 60 more years ahead of me. I'm keeping up with you.
Okay, there you go.
So so the that relationship that I brought in after my marriage, it was actually, in the beginning, it was beautiful. And I mean beautiful because I was leaning in on all this lesson grabbing. I was no longer resisting learning. And I even at this point grabbed onto some kinds of coaches. We know somebody named Nancy Matthews in common.
Yes,
So she was one of my first coaches. Marty Ward, if you know her, I was working with
yes.
her.
Good
And
choices. Good choices.
and Marty actually was technically my first coach. And I have a whole story about that, but let's tell that another time. And it's not that, and and I'm just going to leave with the audience this one thing. This is part of what was happening. I've been hearing this phrase for many years, if not decades, is that a smart person learns from their mistakes, which is the premise by which I operated my life. Smart person learns from their mistakes.
An
However,
emotion.
the
Wait, wait, wait,
wise,
wait. Look, an emotionally smart person.
well, I'd say in both levels, emotion
Okay.
or intellect, will learn from, they can learn for themselves.
Well,
But a wise person
a wise person.
will learn from the mistakes of others.
Ah, that's a great distinction. Yes.
So I'm so several years ago, I made this decision to learn from the mistakes of others. The phrase I had heard many times finally struck home. It finally made sense in a way that it never had before, because I was suddenly able to, like, even though trust had always been an operating word in my life, I had made a decision to lean in on learning something about the inside of me. In order to make that reach inside, I had to, which was a very painful place to go. There was nothing there. It was kind of dark and cavernous and, echoey, like, hello, hello, like in fact, I could make the sound effect. Hello. I can't do it. I guess if it's not working on my device here. Hello. So but the idea is that since I'd been operating in this external frame for most of my life, and I just somehow or other, I had this one experience which kind of left me, well, I had a few along the way. The adoption of my daughter had some impact, and some other things along the way. It kind of opened the door to the idea that I was not a happy camper with this external persona, and that when the marriage was over, I kind of was just going, I have a luxury here that I had never been afforded before, to kind of just lean in on my own life and look carefully at my own journey instead of being reactive and mask up and all those things. I finally just said, let me start looking at the patterns of my life and see what I can do to learn from them. And then, of course, I'm now in this receiving state, self-supportable receiving state. And then that phrase, learn the mistakes by yourself is smart, learn the mistakes from others is wisdom. And I just immediately, picked up a couple of coaches along the way. And it wasn't that and I'm not saying I'm a genius, but it wasn't that I was stupid, although I was emotionally stupid. And I was, and I'm not using that as a sense of judgment. I'm just saying it's just kind of describing this.
All know, exactly. We all know that emotional intelligence is a whole different world of intelligence than IQ or other forms of intelligence. Absolutely.
And I had this one experience. I would almost call it a prophetic or emotion or a spiritual experience of sorts, which maybe it would have to be another whole show. It could be another whole thing by itself. But let's just say is that it did happen that I had an opportunity to just feel kind of a glow of energy inside of me that had never been. It almost felt like it had always been there. It just now is starting to be revealed, and I wanted more of that. And so that's part of this thing. It was something that had come to me almost in a dream, like a tossing, turning night, and then it was like a dream in, dream out, dreamless, dreamful state. I can't explain what it was, but and in that particular night, I kind of had these like epiphanies that were taking place, that were kind of saying, it's time for you to shift. It's time for you to change. You're not happy. You're not happy. Now it's time for you to take ownership of your unhappiness instead of, the way I was looking for medicating it all the time with, whether it was a beautiful woman as a relationship or whether I was successful in my business. All those things were success trappings that supported my external image. And in the meantime, all of that is being sustained by the energy of grief I was not processing. If you think about it, all of that was sustainable only because I was not processing the grief. Otherwise, it might have collapsed much earlier than it did. But because I was so hell-bent on not feeling those lows and not feeling any depression attached to the grief I was not processing, that it finally was coming to a head. So this woman, after the marriage, we were forging a business together. I considered her a love interest. So it was a partnership for me in every way that was possible. But there were lots of red flags looking back on this. But during the thing, I was forging another relationship with some new stuff coming in, some of these new dynamics of self-learning, deep diving, building an internal core, all these other things that were happening for me personally. At the same time as I'm still coaching people, I'm just transitioning from leadership and corporate type work into personal transformation work with people, because in the process of supporting them and their journeys, I'm supporting myself, because as probably anybody would know who's in the space, you do some great healing on your own when you're helping others heal.
So you are now jumping into the pool of the full spectrum of emotions. Is that what you're saying?
Yeah, I was pretty much, and it was definitely new territory, and in many ways, there were moments where it was scary. So some of the old versions of me it wasn't like I just erased it. I was stepping away from it, but the post-marriage relationship which had very, very smooth start, and maybe it was at the halfway part where the wheels started to come off. And it's, and I look at this idea as when people talk about the transition relationships after,
Yes.
very likely that was a pattern I thought wasn't going to be the case. It turned out very likely it was the case. So, however, the thing that was interesting to me is that finally that person just disappeared for all intents and purposes. Now, we had physical distance between us already, and then just no communication. And and we had all kinds of things scheduled, public speaking engagement and some other things we were working on. And so I lost my business partner, my love interest, and I'm a very take a picture of where you're going, vision, and go home in on that vision and pursue the vision, and everything kind of fills in along the way. That's the way I've lived my life in many ways. Now I'm looking at it with spiritual and emotional support and all these other things as part of that vision picture. And then all of it.
And you had risked, you had found the courage, you had allowed yourself to be vulnerable to the point where you were all in, you were in that pool, and then she disappears.
She disappears.
Every person's worst nightmare.
Right. Now, mind you, I look at my relationship with her as just a path to the ultimate trigger on this thing about grief.
Yes. It's lost.
It was another loss, and I lost everything. Because it wasn't just her disappearing; it was the partnership disappearing. Was
the dream.
And the vision went dark. Like I could no longer see. Like I can usually see where I'm going, like I do now, but at the time I could not see I could not see past my hand, so to speak, in terms of what the future held. And I still wasn't processing this. So I went to the public speaking engagement that we were supposed to have done together, and I stand up on stage. I crafted my speech 10 minutes before the presentation, not because of anything, as I didn't know what I was going to talk about. We're on podcast. I could probably speak any way I want to, but I didn't know what I was going to talk about. And then I just had sort of an inspiration and vision download from the universe, whatever it was. And I wrote this whole thing out, and it actually began, not knowing then, it began my platform that I use today. So
isn't that amazing?
It was kind of fortuitous and exciting to look back on and go, holy cow, the universe was working with me then.
Yeah, and you can say thank you to her for coming.
And I have no, now I could just say is that as much pain as that time was, I'm extremely grateful for the fact that when I came, so I drove someplace, 24-hour trip to go do that public speaking engagement because I failed to buy a plane ticket.
Oh, God.
And I wasn't even sure if I was going, and then I made a last minute decision to go.
Right.
And I went, I spoke, and then when I came back, I wasn't feeling well. And to make a long story short, because I could tell this part of the story in another 2 hours of talking, but I ended up,
which we don't have today.
I ended up with,
we might have another time for part 3, but
multiple vectors of life-threatening health issues cropped up immediately. One of which was a pulmonary embolism.
Ooh.
So I now I'm swimming in this new healing arts space, and it very quickly came to me, because I've been hearing this before, that sadness shows up in the lungs. Depression shows up in the lungs.
Yes.
Grief shows up in the lungs, which is why people hyperventilate, or they can't breathe, or they feel the weight of the world is in their chest, right? When they're going through depression and all these things. And here I'm getting the ultimate signal from my body. My body is failing me, so to speak. You would think so, at least. But what I look at it from this is that my unconscious mind was saying to you, you're either going to die or you're going to learn. And when that message arrived with me, then I made another decision, the reversing decision, to go really low,
Wow.
embrace the grief, wallow in it,
Cry. Let
uh,
yourself cry.
revel in it. What
Yes.
crying was like the least of it. It was just look at this as the a place to no longer be afraid of, a place to no longer avoid. Just treat it like it's your best friend who keeps dumping stuff on you. I don't to do with your radio show.
That's
I
okay.
don't talk this way on my own radio show, but but just dumping stuff on you. That friend who keeps coming over and like leaves a trail of debris, chaos. When they're out the door, you're gonna go, whew, that was. But while they were there, it was just whatever the chaos was, and so it was an extraordinary experience. It was, and I just it was a few months. I have to say I wasn't frozen, but I was largely just staying in place because it wasn't like this time I didn't want to skip past it. I did not any longer want to sweep it under the carpet. I didn't any longer want to feel I couldn't have high moments. I didn't want to feel like I couldn't even go low anymore. I'm assuming that my life will have other moments of grief. Somebody or something will come along that creates loss, but I'm completely differently prepared for it today because of that in, intense embracing of grief that I had swept under the carpet for 5+ decades. And so that's why I'm saying I'm grateful to transition woman, um, because that wouldn't have happened without those triggers, or maybe it would have happened in a different way. But I also, the very reason why I made the decision not to go low was because of life-threatening things. And now because of life-threatening things, I made the very decision to go low
So that you could live and
so I could
and
live
experience life and also go high.
and go high.
Right.
And ultimately, since we were talking about grief and love, so I want to kind of connect the dots here. Um, it freed my internal core to have the full revelatory experience as being a foundation in my life, as opposed to being something incidental. So
Right.
now I can wake up each day full of my power, not as others would say, power like you're going to war or power of force, power of my vulnerability and my ability to trust like I've never trusted before, sense of self-love like never felt before, because of embracing and processing and holding on to. It's almost like you're you're forming diamonds in your hand from coal. That kind of thing. It's just
Yes.
the power of your life is shape shifting all this crud into something like a gem now, and having profoundly new ways to discover things too. Like I now see things with some kind of vibrancy and clarity that was not available to me before, because in many ways, when you're operating that narrow emotional band, you still got kinds of protective cloudy layers in your experience that block you from not only just those emotions, but block you from some of the vibrance of life in general. So as to your point, is, my point was grief connected me to love like I've never felt before. Grief connected me to joy like I've never felt before by just leaning in on it. And ultimately, grief connected me because the pulmonary embolism was a life-threatening event. It connected me to breathing and living again like I've never lived before.
That is a beautiful, profound message that I almost don't want to touch. In other words, that's a way of concluding this arc of this conversation that began with this little boy who experienced grief and didn't know what that was. And he instinctively decided to protect himself from feeling that by thinking that he could live a life without feeling the lows, not realizing that by doing that, he'd cut off the highs. And it took you 5 decades to get to this point of realization and feeling what being alive is really all about. And you've reminded us all that grief can be our greatest gift, our greatest treasure, because it's a reminder that life is precious, love is precious, we are precious. What you've touched on, Brian, is how important it is to get to the point where we attain a level of self love that brings us to the capacity of being able to love others deeply, because we're not worrying about, are they going to like us? Are they going to hurt us? Because we've gone down as low as we can go. We felt the depths of that, and we realize that what's far more dangerous for us is to not be willing to feel at all. And Brene Brown says so wisely in the work that she's brought to all of us, vulnerability is the birthplace of belonging, community, connection, and creativity. That without vulnerability, we cannot be intimate with ourselves or with others. And without intimacy, how can we feel the depths of life and the joys of life and the joys of being alive with everything there is to enjoy in every relationship that matters? And if in the relationships that matter, we hold ourselves back because we're afraid, we don't have a relationship. So this conversation is so central to everything this podcast is designed to bring to you, my dear listeners, because it's about how to make love better for yourself, how to make love better for the relationships that you're living so that you can live fully without the fear of feeling the lows, to recognize that the blessing of feeling the lows is being able to feel the highs, being able to feel that great joy and feel the freedom that comes from not having to look over your shoulder or look for someone else to validate you or say to you, you're okay.
You had shared with us a quote or a poem at the beginning of this podcast. And one of the last stanzas in that was that grief was the price of love.
Yes.
And I actually want to say maybe a little bit of a different phrase that has been steeped in my own experience, that grief is the path to love.
That's beautiful. I'd be willing to add to that quote, to expand on that quote. I think from what you shared in this conversation, Brian, I would agree that grief is the path to, because grief is inevitable. It's not inevitable that we acknowledge it or go through it or deal with it, but your story has reminded us all that in all of our lives, there is grief that we don't even see for what it is. And to the extent that it has shut us down, shut us off from being who we are, once we are willing to feel it and to go through it, we do find the path to love, to ourselves and to others. Thank you, Brian. Thank you for your story. Thank you for telling the kind of story that is really everyone's story.
And think about this thing too, is we had shared, this is my final thought, so you can actually close your podcast out. So the thing that my story has brought to the table is I held nothing back. I mean, I may have left some tidbits out just for the protection of others, but I held nothing back about my journey. This story I couldn't have told 10 years ago because it would have been felt shameful, because I was not standing in my power, not having the ability to be vulnerable, not having a sense of self-love that sustains all of these things, not having a sense of trust that I could tell my stories. And I spend my work right now is all about helping people tell their authentic story, because that brings all of these things: truth, trust, love, power, life, everything. into the front burner of their lives, as opposed to something that's been suppressed and or
Beautiful.
stomped on, or whatever the case may be.
Beautiful. So
So I appreciate you letting me share my story. I really do. I appreciate
I
it.
I am so deeply grateful for your telling the story. And I want to give you the opportunity to just plug yourself. I want to shine the spotlight on you and to just remind us where your now current radio show has come from. So we appreciate your story even more fully.
Well, the show, I mean, from my life's mission for the hopefully the next 60 years that's left. Uh, so whatever my journey looks like, wherever it comes to us, my journey is to raise the vibration of all of humanity, or the planet, or however you'd like to do it. And I believe that comes from, essentially, the key word is love. And so I'm building a community called Million Dollar Feeling. It's organic. It's not highly engineered growth or anything like that, although it's picking up its own pace. And nestled inside of that is my radio show. It's a broadcast radio show, not a podcast. No judgments about podcasts. I just think, and eventually I'll have a podcast at the same time, I guess. I love doing the broadcast radio show because it reaches an audience of a different nature. And inside of this is everybody who listens, and they're all available as a podcast in some ways for replay. Everybody who listens should be able to take some tidbit out of every show that will somehow or other uplift their life, or help somebody else uplift theirs, which, by the way, helps us lift our lives up anyway. So Million Dollar Feeling is just this burgeoning community, and now almost 2-year long running broadcast radio show. And it's also the core of my work, which is helping people feel that $1 million feeling. And it's strange that that's the title. Now it just dawns on me how interesting. The title of this operation is a random title that was given to me by somebody else, the person who left my life. So just to make all those trigger things happen, it was her thing, $1 million feeling. But it turns out that's everything I'm doing is about helping people elicit $1 million feeling.
So, Brian Baird, thank you for episode 2 of our inaugural podcast,
Well,
Making Love.
again, thank you for letting me share some time with you. You and I are. I keep feeling every time we talk, it just makes our bonds that much tighter.
It does indeed. So, once again, this is all about making love better. And as you can see, this conversation really addressed some of the most fundamental role that grief plays in helping us to have that $1 million feeling, to have that feel great experience. Because all of life is about how we experience it. And we experience it through our emotions, our spirit, our bodies. Otherwise, we wouldn't be in our bodies. That's why we call the feelings emotions. So I welcome you to join us for the next episode. And until then, I want to say goodbye to all of you and thank you again to Brian Baird. Bye for now.
Bye-bye, everybody.